I must interrupt myself to make it plain that I am not attempting here to give anything in the nature of a description of the philosophical system known as Vedanta. I have nor the knowledge to do so, but even if I had, this would not be the proper place for it. Our conversation was a long one, and Larry told me a great deal more than I felt possible to set down in what, after all, purports to be a novel. My concern is with Larry. I should not have touched on such an intricate subject at all, except that it seemed to me that without at least some slight account of his speculations and the singular experiences that were perhaps occasioned by them, I could not give plausibility to the line of conduct which he was led to adopt, and with which I shall presently acquaint the reader. It irks me that I cannot hope with any words of mine to give an idea of the pleasantness of his voice, that invested even in his most casual utterance with persuasiveness, or of the constant change in his expression from grave to gently gay, from reflective to playful, that accompanied his thoughts like the ripple of a piano when the violins with a great sweep sing the several themes of a concerto. Although he spoke of serious things, he spoke of them quite naturally, in a conversational tone, with a certain diffidence, perhaps, but without any more constraints than if he had been speaking of the weather and the crops. If I've given the impression that there was anything didactic in his manner, the fault is mine. His modesty was as evident as his sincerity. There was no more than a sprinkling of people in the cafe. The rosterers had long since departed. The sad creatures who make business of love had gone to their sordid dwellings. Now and then a tired-looking man came in to have a glass of beer and a sandwich, or one who seemed only half awake for a cup of coffee. White-collar workers, one who had been on a night shift and was going home to bed, the other, roused by the call of an alarm clock, was on his unwilling way to the long day's labor. Larry appeared as unconscious of the time as of the surroundings. I found myself in the course of my life in many strange situations. More than once I have been within a hair's breadth of death. More than once I have touched hands with romance and known it. I have ridden a pony through Central Asia along the road that Marco Polo took to reach the fabulous lands of Cathay. I have drunk a glass of Russian tea in a prim parlor in Petrograd while a soft-spoken little man in a black coat and striped trousers told me how he had assassinated a Grand Duke. I have sat in a drawing-room in Westminster and listened to the serene geniality of a piano trio of Haydn's while the bombs were crashing without. But I do not think I have ever found myself in a stranger situation than when I sat on the red plush seats of that garish restaurant for hour after hour, while Larry talked of God and eternity, of the absolute and the weary wheel of endless becoming. Larry had been silent for a few minutes, and unwilling to hurry him, I waited. Presently he gave me a friendly little smile, as though he had suddenly once more become aware of me. When I got down to Travancore, I found I needn't have asked for information about Shriganesha. Everyone knew of him. For many years he had lived in a cave in the hills, but finally he had been persuaded to move down to a plain where some charitable person had given him a plot of land and had built a little adobe house for him. It was a long way from Trivandrum, the capital, and it took me all day, first by train and then by bullock cart, to get to the ashram. I found a young man at the entrance of the compound and asked him if I could see the yogi. I brought with me the basket of fruit, which is the customary gift to offer. In a few minutes, the young man came back and led me to a long hall with windows all around it. In one corner, Sri Ganesha sat in the attitude of meditation on a raised dais, covered with a tiger skin. "I've been expecting you," he said. I was surprised, but suppose my friend Medora had told him something about me. But he shook his head when I mentioned his name. I presented my fruit, and he told the young man to take it away. We were left alone, and he looked at me without speaking. I don't know how long the silence lasted. It might have been for half an hour. I've told you what he looked like. What I haven't told you is the sincerity that he irradiated, the goodness, the peace, the selflessness. I was hot and tired after my journey, but gradually I began to feel wonderfully rested. Before he'd said another word, I knew that this was the man I'd been seeking. "Did he speak English?" I interrupted. "No. But I'm pretty quick at languages. I picked up enough Tamil to understand and make myself understood in the South." At last he spoke. "What have you come here for?" he asked. I began to tell him how I'd come to India and how I passed my time for 3 years, how on report of the wisdom and sanctity I'd gone from one holy man after another and had found no one to give me what I looked for. He interrupted me. "All that I know. There is no need to tell me. What have you come here for?" "So that you may be my guru," I answered. "Brahman alone is the guru," he said. He continued to look at me with a strange intensity, and then suddenly his body became rigid, his eyes seemed to turn inward, and I saw that he had fallen into a trance which the Indians call samadhi, and in which they hold the duality of subject and object vanishes, and you become knowledge absolute. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of him, and my heart beat violently. After how long a time, I don't know, he sighed, and I realized that he had recovered normal consciousness. He gave me a glance, sweet with loving kindness. "Stay," he said. "They will show you where you may sleep." I was given as a dwelling place the shack in which Sri Ganesha had lived when first he came down to the plain. The hall in which he now passed both day and night had been built when disciples gathered around him, and more people, attracted by his fame, came to visit him. So that I mightn't be conspicuous, I adopted the comfortable Indian dress, and I got so sunburnt that unless your attention was drawn to me, you might have taken me for a native. I read a great deal. I meditated. I listened to Sri Ganesh when he chose to talk. He didn't talk very much, but he was always willing to answer questions, and it was wonderfully inspiring to listen to him. It was like music to your ears. Though in his youth he had himself practiced very severe austerities, he did not enjoin them on his disciples. He sought to wean them from the slavery of selfhood, passion, and sense, and told them that they could acquire liberation by tranquility, restraint, renunciation, resignation, by steadfastness of mind, and by an ardent desire for freedom. People used to come from the nearby town 3 or 4 miles away, where there was a famous temple to which great crowds flocked once a year for a festival. They came from Trivandrum and from far-off places to tell him their troubles, to ask his advice, to listen to his teachings, and all went away strengthened in a soul and at peace with themselves. What he taught was very simple. He taught that we are all greater than we know, and that wisdom is the means to freedom. He taught that it is not essential to salvation to retire from the world, but only to renounce the self. He taught that work done with no selfish interest purifies the mind, and that duties are opportunities afforded to man to sink his separate self and become one with the universal self. But it wasn't his teachings that was so remarkable. It was the man himself, his benignity, his greatness of soul, his saintliness. His presence was a benediction. I was very happy with him. I felt that at last I had found what I wanted. The weeks, the months passed with unimaginable rapidity. I proposed to stay either till he died, and he told us that he did not intend very much longer to inhabit his perishable body, or till I received illumination, the state when you have at last burst the bonds of ignorance, and know with a certainty that there is no disputing that you and the Absolute are one. And then, if what they say is true, there is nothing more. The soul's course on earth is ended, and it will return no more. And is Sri Ganesha dead? I asked. Not so far as I know. As he spoke, he saw what was impelled in my question and gave a light laugh. He went on after a moment's hesitation, but in such a manner as led me at first to suppose that he wished to avoid answering the second question that he well knew was on the tip of my tongue, the question, of course, whether he had received illumination. I didn't stay at the ashram continuously. I was lucky enough to make the acquaintance of a native forestry officer whose permanent residence was on the outskirts of a village at the foot of the mountains. He was a devotee of Sri Ganesha, and when he could get away from work, he came and spent 2 or 3 days with us. He was a nice fellow, and we had long talks. He liked to practice his English on me. After I'd known him for some time, he told me that the forestry service had a bungalow up in the mountains, and if I ever wanted to go there to be by myself, he would give me the key. I went there now and then. It was a 2-day journey. First, you had to go by bus to the forestry officer's village. Then you had to walk. But when you got there, it was magnificent in its grandeur and in its solitude. I took what I could in a knapsack on my back and hired a bearer to carry provisions for me. And I stayed till they were exhausted. It was only a log cabin with a cookhouse behind it, and for furniture there was nothing but a trestle bed on which to put your sleeping mat, a table, and a couple chairs. It was cool up there, and at times it was pleasant to light a fire at night. It gave me a wonderful thrill to know that there wasn't a living soul within 20 miles of me. At night I used often to hear the roar of a tiger or the racket of elephants as they crashed through the jungle. I used to take long walks in the forest. There was one place I loved to sit because from it I saw the mountains spread before me and below, a lake to which at dusk the wild animals, deer, pig, bison, elephant, leopard, came to drink. When I'd been at the ashram just 2 years, I went up to my forest retreat for a reason that'll make you smile. I wanted to spend my birthday there. I got there the day before. Next morning I awoke before dawn and thought I'd go see the sunrise from the place I've just told you about. I knew the way blindfolded. I sat down under a tree and waited. It was night still, but the stars were pale in the sky, and day was at hand. I had a strange feeling of suspense, so gradually that I was hardly aware of it. Light began to filter through the darkness, slowly, like a mysterious figure slinking between the trees. I felt my heart beating as though at the approach of danger. The sun rose. Larry paused, and a rueful smile played on his lips. I have no descriptive talent. I don't know the words to paint a picture. I can't tell you so as to make you see it, how grand the sight was that was displayed before me as the day broke in its splendor. Those mountains with their deep jungle, the mist still entangled in the treetops, and the bottomless lake far below me. The sun caught the lake through a cleft in the heights, and it shone like a burnished steel. I was ravished with the beauty of the world. I'd never known such exaltation and such a transcendent joy. I had a strange sensation, a tingling that arose in my feet and traveled up to my head, and I felt as though I were suddenly released from my body, and as pure spirit partook a loveliness I had never conceived. I had a sense that a knowledge more than human possessed me, so that everything that had been confused was clear, and everything that had perplexed me was explained. I was so happy that it was pain, and I struggled to release myself from it, for I felt that it had lasted a moment longer I should die, and yet it was such a rapture that I was ready to die rather than forego it. How can I tell you what I felt? No words can tell the ecstasy of my bliss. When I came to myself, I was exhausted and trembling. I fell asleep. It was high noon when I woke. I walked back to the bungalow, and I was so light at heart that it seemed to me that I hardly touched the ground. I made myself some food. Gosh, I was hungry, and I lit my pipe. Larry lit his pipe now. I dared not think that this was illumination that I, Larry Darrell of Marvin, Illinois, had received, when others, striving for it for years with austerity and mortification, still waited. What makes you think that it was anything more than a hypnotic condition induced by your state of mind combined with your solitude, the mystery of the dawn, and the burnished steel of your lake? Only my overwhelming sense of its reality. After all, it was an experience of the same order as the mystics have had all over the world through all the centuries. Brahmins in India, Sufis in Persia, Catholics in Spain, Protestants in New England, and so far as they've been able to describe what defines description, they've described it in similar terms. It's impossible to deny the fact that occurrence, and only difficulty is to explain it. If I was for a moment one with the Absolute, or if it was an inrush from the subconscious of affinity with the universal spirit which is latent in all of us, I wouldn't know. Larry paused for an instant and threw me a quizzical glance. "By the way, can you touch your little finger with your thumb?" he asked. "Of course," I said with a laugh, proving it with the appropriate action. "Are you aware that that's something that only man and the primates can do? It's because the thumb is opposable to the other digits that the hand is the admirable instrument it is. Isn't it possible that the opposable thumb, doubtless in a rudimentary form, was developed in the remote ancestor of man and the gorilla and certain individuals, and was a characteristic that, only because common to all after innumerable generations? Isn't it at least possible that these experiences of oneness with reality that so many diverse persons have had point to a development in the human consciousness of a sixth sense, which in the far, far future will be common to all men, so that they may have as direct a perception of the absolute as we have now of the objects of sense? And how would you expect that to affect them? I asked. I can as little tell you that as the first creature that found it could touch its little finger with its thumb could have told you that the infinite consequences were entailed in that insignificant action. So far as I'm concerned, I can only tell you that the intense sense of peace, joy, and assurance that possessed me in that moment of rapture abides with me still, and that the vision of this world's beauty is as fresh and vivid now as when my eyes were first dazzled by it. But Larry, surely your idea of absolute forces you to believe that the world and its beauty are merely an illusion, the fabric of Maya? It's a mistake to think that the Indians look upon the world as an illusion. They don't. All they claim is that it's not real in the same sense as the absolute. Maya is only a speculation devised by those ardent thinkers to explain how the infinite could produce the finite. Samkara, the wisest of them all, decided that it was an insoluble mystery. You see, the difficulty is to explain why Brahman, which is being, bliss and intelligence, which is unalterable, which ever is and forever maintains itself in rest, which lacks nothing and needs nothing, and so know neither change nor strife, which is perfect, should create the world. Well, if you ask that question, the answer you're generally given is that the Absolute created the world in sport without reference to any purpose. But when you think of flood and famine, of earthquake and hurricane, and all the ills that flesh is heir to, your moral sense is outraged at the idea that so much that is shocking can have been created in play. Shri Ganesha had too much kindliness of heart to believe that. He looked upon the world as the expression of the Absolute and as the overflow of its perfection. He taught that God cannot help creating and that the world is a manifestation of his nature. When I asked how, if the world was a manifestation of the nature of a perfect being, it should be so hateful that the only reasonable aim man can set before him is to liberate himself from its bondage, Shri Ganesh answered that the satisfactions of the world are transitory, and that only the finite gives enduring happiness, but endless duration makes good no better, nor white any whiter. If the rose at noon has lost its beauty it had at dawn, the beauty it had then was real. Nothing in this world is permanent, and we're foolish when we ask anything to last. But surely we're still more foolish not to take delight in it while we have it. If change is of the essence of existence, one would have thought it only sensible so to make it a premise of our philosophy. We can, none of us, step into the same river twice, but the river flows on, and the other river we step into is cool and refreshing too. The Aryans, when they first came down into India, saw that the world we know is but an appearance of the world we know not. But they welcomed it as gracious and beautiful. It was only centuries later, when the exhaustion of consequence, when the debilitating climate had slapped their vitality, so they became a prey to invading hordes, that they saw only evil in life and craved for liberation from its return. But why should we of the West, we Americans especially, be daunted by decay and death, hunger and thirst, sickness, old age, grief and delusion? The spirit of life is strong in us. I felt more alive then as I sat in my log cabin smoking my pipe than I had ever felt before. I felt in myself an energy that cried out to be expended. It was not for me to leave the world and retire to a cloister, but to live in the world and love the objects of the world, not indeed for themselves, but for the infinite that is in them. If in those moments of ecstasy I had indeed been one with the Absolute, then, if what they said was true, nothing could touch me, and when I had worked out the karma of my present life, I should return no more. The thought filled me with dismay. I wanted to live again and again. I was willing to accept every sort of life, no matter what its pain and sorrow. I felt that only after life after life could satisfy my eagerness, my vigor, and my curiosity. Next morning, I started down the mountain, and the day after arrived at the ashram. Shri Ganesh was surprised to see me in European clothes. I'd put them on at the forestry officer's bungalow when I started uphill because it was colder there and hadn't thought to change them. "I've come to bid you farewell, Master," I said. "I'm going back to my own people." He did not speak. He was sitting, as ever, cross-legged on a tiger's skin on the day. A stick of incense burnt in the brazier before it and scented the air with its faint fragrance. He was alone, as he had been on the first day I saw him. He looked at me with an intensity so piercing that I had the impression he saw into the deepest recesses of my being. I know he knew what had happened. "It is well," he said. "You have been gone long enough." I went down on my knees, and he gave me his blessing. When I rose to my feet, my eyes were filled with tears. He was a man of noble and saintly character. I shall always look upon it as a privilege to have known him. I said goodbye to the devotees. Some had been there for years, some had come after me. I left my few belongings and my books, thinking they might be useful to someone, and with my knapsack on my back, in the same old slacks and brown coat I had arrived in, a battered toppy on my head, I trudged back to the town. A week later, I boarded a ship at Bombay and landed at Marcellus. Silence fell upon us as we pursued our separate reflections. But tired though I was, there was one more point which I very much wanted to put to him. And it was I who finally spoke. "Larry, old boy," I said, "this long quest of yours started with the problem of evil. It was the problem of evil that urged you on. You've said nothing all this time to indicate that you've reached a tentative solution of it. It may be that there is no solution, or it may be that I'm not clever enough to find it." Ramakrishna looked upon the world as a sport of God. "It is like a game," he said. "The game, there are joy and sorrow, virtue and vice, knowledge and ignorance, good and evil. The game cannot continue if sin and suffering are together eliminated from the creation. I would reject that with all my strength. The best I can suggest is that when the Absolute manifested itself in the world, evil was natural correlation of good. You could never have had the stupendous beauty of the Himalayas without the unimaginable horror of the convulsion of the earth's crust. The Chinese craftsman who makes a vase in what they call eggshell porcelain can give it a lovely shape, ornament it with a beautiful design, stain it with a ravishing color, and give it a perfect glaze. But from its very nature, he can't make it anything but fragile. If you drop it on the floor, it will break into a dozen fragments. Isn't it possible in the same way that the values we cherish in the world can only exist in combination with evil? It is an ingenious notion, Larry. I don't think it's very satisfactory." "Neither do I," he smiled. "The best to be said for it is that when you've come to the conclusion that something is inevitable, all you can do is make the best of it. What are your plans now?" "I've got a job of work to finish here, and then I shall go back to America." "What to do?" "Live." "How?" He answered very coolly, but with impish twinkle in his eyes, for he knew very well how little I expected such a reply. "With calmness, forbearance, compassion, selflessness, and continence." "A tall order," I said. "And why continence?" "You're a young man. It is wise to attempt to suppress what with hunger is the strongest instinct of the human animal." I am in the fortunate position that sexual indulgence with me has been a pleasure rather than a need. I know by personal experience that in nothing are the wise men of India more dead right than in their contention that chastity intensely enhances the power of spirit. I should have thought that wisdom consisted in striking a balance between the claims of the body and the claims of the spirit. That's just what the Indian maintains that we in the West haven't done. They think that we, with our countless inventions, with our factories and our machines and all they produce, have sought happiness in material things. But that happiness rests not in them, but in spiritual things. And they think the way we have chosen leads to destruction. And are you under the impression that America is a suitable place to practice the particular virtues you mentioned? I don't see why not. You Europeans know nothing about America because we amass large fortunes. You think we care for nothing but money. We care nothing for it. The moment we have it, we spend it. Sometimes well, sometimes ill, but we spend it. Money is nothing to us. It's merely the symbol of success. We are the greatest idealists in the world. I happen to think that we've set our ideal on the wrong objects. I happen to think that the greatest ideal man can set before himself is self-perfection. It's a noble one, Larry. Isn't it worthwhile to try to live up to it? But can you, for a moment, imagine that you, one man, can have any effect on such a restless, busy, lawless, intensely individualistic people as the people of America? You might as well try to hold back the waters of the Mississippi with your bare hands. I can try. It was one man who invented the wheel. It was one man who discovered the law of gravitation. Nothing that happens is without effect. If you throw a stone in a pond, the universe isn't quite the same as it was before. It's a mistake to think that those holy men of India lead useless lives. They are shining light in the darkness. They represent an ideal that is a refreshment to their fellows. The common run may never attain it, but they respect it, and it affects their lives for good. When a man becomes pure and perfect, the influence of his character spreads so that they who seek truth are naturally drawn to him. It may be that if I lead the life I planned for myself, it may affect others. The effect may be no greater than the ripple caused by a stone thrown in a pond, but one ripple causes another, and that one a third. It's just possible that a few people will see that my way of life offers happiness and peace, and that they, in their turn, will teach what they have learned to others. I wonder if you have any idea what you're up against, Larry. You know, the Philistines have long since discarded the rack and stake as a means of suppressing the opinions they feared. They've discovered a much more deadly weapon of destruction, the wisecrack. I'm a pretty tough guy, smiled Larry. Well, all I can say is that it's damn lucky for you that you have a private income. It's been of great use to me. Except for that, I shouldn't have been able to do all I've done. But my apprenticeship is over. From now on, it can only be a burden to me. I shall rid myself of it. That would be very unwise. The only thing that may make the kind of life you propose possible is financial independence. On the contrary, financial independence would make the life I propose meaningless. I couldn't restrain a gesture of impatience. It may be all very well for the wandering medicant in India. He can sleep under a tree, and the pious are willing enough to acquire merit by filling his begging bowl with food. But in America, climate is far from suitable for sleeping out in the open, and though I don't pretend to know much about America, I do know that if there's one thing your countrymen are agreed upon, is that if you want to eat, you must work. My poor Larry, you've been sent to the workhouse as a vagrant before ever you got into your stride. He laughed. I know. One must adapt oneself to one's environment, and of course I'd work. When I got to America, I shall get a job in a garage. I'm a pretty good mechanic, and I don't think it ought to be difficult. Wouldn't you then be wasting energy that might be more useful employed in other ways? I like the manual labor. Whenever I got waterlogged with study, I've taken a spell of it and found it spiritually invigorating. I remember reading a biography of Spinoza and thinking how silly the author was to look upon it as terrible hardship that in order to earn his scanty living in Spinoza had to polish lenses. I'm sure it was a help to his intellectual activity, if only because it diverted his attention from it while from the hard work of speculation. My mind is free when I'm washing a car or tinkering with a carburetor, and when the job's done, I have the pleasant sensation of having accomplished something. Naturally, I wouldn't want to stay in the garage indefinitely. It's many years since I was in America, and I must learn it afresh. I shall try to get to work as a truck driver, and that way I should be able to travel from end to end of the country. You've forgotten perhaps the most important use of money. It saves time. Life is so short and there's so much to do. One could afford to waste a minute. And just think how much you waste, for instance, in walking from place to place instead of going by bus and instead of going by taxi. Larry smiled. True enough, and I hadn't thought of it, but I could cope with that difficulty by having my own taxi. What do you mean by that? Eventually I shall settle in New York, among other reasons because of its libraries. I can live on very little. I don't mind where I sleep, and I'm quite satisfied with one meal a day. By the time I've seen all I want to see of America, I should be able to have saved enough to buy a taxi and become a taxi driver. You ought to shut up, Larry. You're as crazy as a loon. Not at all. I'm very sensible and practical. As an owner-driver, I would need to work only for as many hours as I could provide for my board and lodging and for the depreciation of the car. The rest of my time I could devote to other work, and if I wanted to go anywhere in a hurry, I could always go in my taxi. But Larry, a taxi is just as much of a possession as a government bond, I said, to tease him. As an owner-driver, you'd be a capitalist. He laughed. No, my taxi would merely be the instrument of my labor. It would be an equivalent to the staff and the begging bowl of a wandering medicine. On this note of banter, our conversation ended. I had noted for some time that people were coming into the cafe with great frequency. One man in evening dress sat down not far from us and ordered himself a substantial breakfast. He had the tired but satisfied mien of one of those looks by with complacency upon the night of amorous dalliance. A few old gentlemen, early risers because old age needs little sleep, were drinking their café au lait with deliberation, while through thick-lensed spectacles they read the morning paper. Younger men, some of them neat and spruce, others in threadbare coats, hurried in to devour a roll and swallow a cup of coffee on their way to a shop or an office. An old crone entered with a pile of newspapers, went around offering them for sale, vainly as far as I could see at the various tables. I looked out of the great plate windows and saw that it was broad daylight. A minute or two later the electric light was turned off except at the rear of the huge restaurant. I looked at my watch. It was past 7 o'clock. What about a spot of breakfast? I said. We had croissants, all crisp and hot from the baker's, and café au lait. I was tired and listless, and felt certain I looked like a wrath of God. But Larry seemed as fresh as ever. His eyes were shining. There wasn't a line on his smooth face, and he didn't look a day more than 25. The coffee revived me. Will you allow me to give you a piece of advice, Larry? It's not a thing I give often. It's not a thing I take often, he answered with a grin. Will you think very carefully before you dispose yourself of your very small fortune? When it's gone forever. A time may come when you'll want money very badly, either for yourself or for somebody else, and then you'll bitterly regret that you were such a fool. There was a glint of mockery in his eyes as he answered, but it was devoid of malice. You attach more importance to money than I do. I can well believe it, I answered tartly. You see, you've always had it, and I haven't. It's given me what I value almost more than anything else in life: independence. You can think what a comfort it's been to me to think that if I wanted to, I could tell anyone in the world to go to hell. But I don't want to tell anyone in the world to go to hell, and if I did, the lack of bank balance wouldn't prevent me. You see, money to you means freedom. To me, it means bondage. You're an obstinate brute, Larry. I know I can't help it, but in any case, I have plenty of time to change my mind if I want to. I'm not going back to America till next spring. My friend Auguste Cotet, the painter, has lent me a cottage at Sanary, and I'm going to spend the winter there. Sanary is an unpretentious seaside resort on the Riviera between Bandol and Toulon, and is frequented by artists and writers who do not care for the garish mummery of Saint-Tropez. You'll like it if you don't mind its being as dull as ditch water. I have work to do. I've collected a lot of material, and I'm going to write a book. What's it about? You'll see when it comes out, he smiled. If you'd like to send it to me when it's finished, I think I can get it published for you. You needn't bother about that. I have some American friends who run a small press in Paris, and I've arranged with them to print it for me. But you can't expect a book brought out like that to have any sale, and you won't get any reviews. I don't care if it's reviewed, and I don't expect it to sell. I'm only printing enough copies to send to my friends in India and the few people I know in France who might be interested in it. It's of no particular importance. I'm only writing it to get all that material out of the way, and I'm publishing it because I think you can only tell what a thing's like when you see it in print. I see the point of both those reasons. We had finished our breakfast by now, and I called the waiter for the bill. When I came, I passed it over to Larry. If you're going to chuck your money down the drain, you can damn well pay for my breakfast. He laughed and paid. I was stiff from sitting so long as we walked out of the restaurant, and my sides ached. It was good to get into the fresh, clean air of the autumn morning. The sky was blue, and the Avenue de Clichy, sordid thoroughfare by night, had a mild jauntiness, like a painted, haggard woman walking with a girl's springy step that was not displeasing. I signaled a passing taxi. "Can I give you a lift?" I asked Larry. "No, I shall walk down the Seine and have a swim at one of the baths. Then I must go to the bibliothèque. I've got some research to do there." We shook hands, and I watched him cross the road with his loose, long-legged stride. I, being made of stuff less stern, stepped into a taxi and returned to my hotel. When I got into my sitting room, I noticed that it was after 8. "This is a nice hour for an elderly gentleman to get home," I remarked disapprovingly to the nude lady under a glass case, who had, since the year 1813, been lying on top of the clock in what I should have thought was a position of extreme discomfort. She continued to look at her gilt bronze face in a gilt bronze mirror, and all the clock said was tick, tick. I turned on a hot bath. When I had lain in it till it was tepid, I dried myself, swallowed a sleeping tablet, and taken to bed with me Valéry's Le Cimetière Marin which happens to be on a night table. I read till I fell asleep.